On the chilly afternoon of January 14, 1943, as the high-stakes Casablanca Conference entered its final tense days, Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Franklin D. Roosevelt, surrounded by their combined military chiefs, made a momentous, war-altering decision that would forever shift the focus of the Western Allies. The long-anticipated cross-channel invasion of France, the primary strategic goal, long cherished by the Americans and codenamed Operation Sledgehammer, was deemed not yet logistically or militarily possible. The necessary landing craft were critically unavailable. The troops were insufficiently trained and equipped for such a massive and perilous undertaking, and the threat of German U-boats in the Atlantic remained unacceptably high, posing a grave risk to any large-scale troop movement. Instead, they would strike at what Churchill famously, and perhaps misleadingly called, the soft underbelly of Europe, a phrase that would later haunt the British command as a tragic misnomer. The immediate target was the strategically vital island of Sicily, the gateway to the Mediterranean and the Italian mainland. This operation, codenamed Husky, would be the largest amphibious assault the world had yet seen, a colossal gamble designed to knock Italy out of the war, secure the Mediterranean sea lanes for Allied shipping, and critically, draw crucial German divisions away from the Eastern Front, a promise made to Stalin to alleviate the immense pressure on the Soviet Union. The decision was a triumph of British strategic thinking, which prioritized a peripheral approach, seeking to exploit the Axis's weakest link and tighten the noose gradually, over the American desire for a direct, massive confrontation in Northern Europe. The debate in the conference room was fierce and protracted, with American strategists like General Marshall arguing passionately that the Mediterranean was a suction pump that would drain invaluable resources from the decisive battle in France, while Churchill, with his characteristic eloquence and force of will, countered that the only way to get to the heart of the German enemy was to first cut off its limbs in the Mediterranean. This pivotal decision, however, papered over a deep, fundamental schism between the Allied commanders and their political masters, a strategic fault line that ran through the entire campaign and would influence Allied strategy for the remainder of the war. General George Marshall and the American staff viewed the entire Mediterranean theater with profound skepticism, seeing it as a costly resource-sucking diversionary sideshow, pulling essential landing craft, ships, and men away from the main effort, the eventual invasion of France, now codenamed Overlord. They feared the campaign would become an endless, costly entanglement in difficult mountain terrain, a fear that would prove prescient. For Churchill and the British, however, it was the logical, necessary continuation of the successful North African campaign, a chance to maintain relentless pressure on a reeling enemy, protect the vital imperial supply route through the Suez Canal, the lifeline of the British Empire, and force a dispersion of German forces. The man chosen to command the entire operation, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, found himself constantly straddling this strategic fault line, a master diplomat forced to manage the colossal egos and conflicting military doctrines of two great nations in a fragile alliance. His deputy, the charismatic, brilliant, and notoriously temperamental General Bernard Montgomery, would command the British Eighth Army, the famed Desert Rats, while the equally headstrong, aggressive, and media-savvy General George Patton would lead the US Seventh Army. The stage was set for a campaign as fraught with inter-allied rivalry and strategic disagreement as it was with the mortal danger posed by the Axis forces. The command structure itself, with Eisenhower overseeing two fiercely independent and competitive field commanders, was a recipe for the friction that would inevitably follow and complicate military operations. The planning for Husky was a nightmare of compromise, complexity, and clashing personalities that nearly doomed the operation before it began. The initial plan, drafted by Eisenhower's staff, called for the Allied armies to land in widely dispersed sectors all around the Sicilian coast, a strategy designed to confuse the enemy and seize multiple ports, but which dangerously diluted Allied strength and made mutual support impossible. Montgomery, reviewing the plans in late April, was aghast. He stormed into a planning conference and declared the scheme a dog's breakfast that would inevitably lead to the piecemeal destruction of the Allied forces by concentrated German panzer divisions, a lesson he had learned bitterly in the desert warfare of North Africa. He insisted, with his characteristic unyielding force of will, on a single, concentrated landing in the southeast, with his Eighth Army going ashore on the eastern beaches and Patton's Seventh Army on the western flank, allowing for mutual support and a rapid build-up of force. The Americans were furious at being relegated to a flank protection role, essentially covering Montgomery's advance up the eastern coast towards Messina, but Eisenhower, recognizing the tactical soundness of Monty's argument and the grave danger of the original plan, reluctantly agreed. The final plan was a testament to Montgomery's force of will, but it planted deep seeds of resentment within the American command structure that would blossom into open and damaging friction in the Sicilian sun. The revised plan concentrated the landing zones, allowing the Allies to rapidly seize the southeastern airfields and ports, a critical modification that ensured the initial success of the invasion, but set the conditions for the subsequent rivalry. As the planners argued and the massive invasion force assembled in ports across North Africa, the Allied intelligence services devised one of the war's most audacious and successful deceptions: Operation Mincemeat. On April 30th, 1943, the body of a fictitious Major Martin, a Royal Marine officer who had supposedly died in a plane crash, was carefully washed ashore in Spain, carrying a briefcase containing fake, highly convincing documents that suggested an imminent Allied invasion of Greece and Sardinia. The ruse worked perfectly, a masterpiece of psychological warfare. German high command, including Hitler himself, was completely convinced, diverting crucial panzer divisions from France to the Balkans and, crucially, preventing the substantial reinforcement of the Axis defences in Sicily. The German 1st Panzer Division was moved to Greece, and other units were diverted to Sardinia and Corsica, a massive misallocation of resources that gifted the Allies the priceless element of strategic surprise. The success of Mincemeat was a profound demonstration of the power of strategic deception, a psychological victory won before the first shot was fired, and a key factor in the low initial resistance the Allied troops would face on the beaches. The weeks leading up to the invasion were dominated by the Allied air forces, which executed a massive and relentless aerial campaign to win air superiority and isolate the battlefield, a phase often overlooked but absolutely crucial to the operation's success. Allied planes, including Spitfires, P-38 Lightnings and heavy bombers, relentlessly pounded Axis airfields in Sicily and southern Italy, destroying hundreds of enemy aircraft on the ground and forcing the remainder to withdraw to the mainland, their effectiveness severely curtailed. This achieved the vital goal of air superiority, ensuring that the vast invasion fleet would not be decimated by the Luftwaffe as it approached the coast. Simultaneously, a massive interdiction campaign targeted roads, rail lines, bridges, and ports, effectively cutting off the island from reinforcement and supply from the Italian mainland. By the time the invasion began, the Axis forces in Sicily were largely isolated, operating with limited air cover and logistical support, a critical vulnerability that the Allies would exploit. On the night of July 9, 1943, a vast armada of over 3,000 ships and landing craft, carrying 160,000 men, ploughed through heavy, churning seas towards the Sicilian coast. Aboard, the nerves of thousands of American, British, and Canadian troops were stretched taut, not just by the anticipation of battle, but by the sheer violence of the weather. A fierce, unexpected gale, with winds reaching 40 miles per hour, threatened to scatter the entire invasion fleet and swamp the fragile landing craft. The decision was made to press on, a colossal gamble that the element of surprise, enhanced by the mincemeat deception, would outweigh the terrible weather conditions. As the landing craft pitched and rolled violently towards the dark shoreline in the early hours of July 10th, the sky was torn apart by the roar of Allied aircraft and the thunderous, earth-shattering bombardment from naval guns. The response from the Italian coastal divisions was sporadic, disorganized, and often half-hearted, with many soldiers surrendering without a fight. The mincemeat deception had done its work perfectly, leaving the Italian defenders confused about the true point of attack and ill-prepared for an assault on Sicily. The airborne operations, intended to secure key bridges and passes ahead of the main landings, were marred by the gale, which scattered the paratroopers of the American 82nd and British 1st Airborne Divisions far and wide across the countryside. Yet this very confusion further paralyzed the Italian defense command structure. The landings, though chaotic due to the weather, were overwhelmingly successful. On the American beaches at Gela, Scogliti, and Licata, Patton's men waded ashore against light and disorganized opposition. The Italian defenders, many of whom had little desire to die for Mussolini or the German cause, quickly surrendered, or melted away into the interior. On the British beaches to the east, Montgomery's veterans of the North African campaign stormed ashore with similar ease, swiftly capturing the port of Syracuse intact, a major logistical prize. The first day's objectives were taken with surprising speed, leading to a dangerous sense of complacency among some Allied commanders. But the easy advance was deceptive. As the Allies pushed inland from the beaches, they were about to collide with their real opponent, the hardened professionals of the German 15th Panzer Grenadier Division and the elite Hermann Göring Panzer Division, which had been strategically held in reserve and were now rushing to the front with characteristic efficiency. The true test of American mettle came at the Jella Plain, where elements of the Hermann Göring Division launched a fierce, coordinated counterattack with Tiger and Panzer IV tanks, aiming to drive the Americans back into the sea before they could consolidate their beachhead. For a few desperate hours, the battle hung in the balance, a terrifying moment where the entire invasion was nearly thrown back into the water. US infantry, supported by brave naval gunfire from destroyers that courageously closed to within point-blank range of the coast, fought off the panzers in a close-quarters battle. The USS Shubrick and the USS Gleaves were instrumental, firing directly at the German tanks, their high-explosive shells tearing through the armor at short range. It was a brutal introduction to the Wehrmacht for many Green American troops, but they held the line with tenacity, a testament to their resilience and the crucial, life-saving support of the Navy. Meanwhile, on the British front, Montgomery, concerned about the strong German defences along the direct route to the key objective of Messina, made a fateful decision. He requested, and Eisenhower approved, a shift in the army boundaries that would give the British 8th Army use of the main coastal highway, Route 114, to Messina, a road that had been originally assigned to the US 7th Army for its advance. When George Patton received the order effectively sidelining his army, relegating him to a static flank protection role in the west, he was incandescent with rage. Seeing his chance for glory and for demonstrating American combat prowess slipping away, he took a daring and unauthorized decision that would define the rest of the campaign. With his political acumen and relentless drive, he persuaded his superiors to let him push west and then north, capturing the symbolic port of Palermo in a spectacular, rapid blitz across the island's interior. He then turned east, racing Montgomery to Messina along the northern coastal road. What followed was not a coordinated Allied drive to trap the German army, but two separate, fiercely competitive races with Patton and Montgomery as the rival contestants. The campaign degenerated into a personal duel, a high-stakes competition that, while militarily successful in clearing the island of enemy forces, exposed deep, corrosive fissures in the Allied high command and led to a less than optimal exploitation of the victory. Patton's drive to Palermo, covering 100 miles in 72 hours, was a stunning display of American mobility and aggression, but it was a move driven as much by personal pride and a desire to upstage Montgomery as by sound military necessity. The German and Italian forces, skillfully conducted by General Friedrich von Senger und Ettelin and later by the brilliant General Hans Valentin Huber, fought a masterful delaying action. They blew up bridges, laid extensive minefields, and established a series of strong defensive lines across the mountainous terrain, exacting a heavy toll for every mile the Allies advanced. Their ultimate goal was not to hold Sicily, a task they knew was impossible in the long run, but to execute a flawless evacuation of their forces across the Strait of Messina to the Italian mainland. Under a massive, impenetrable umbrella of hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, they succeeded in a remarkable strategic evacuation, shipping over 100,000 men, 10,000 vehicles and vast supplies to fight another day. This operation, codenamed Lehrgang, was a masterpiece of military organization under fire, a final humiliating triumph for the Axis in Sicily that negated much of the strategic potential of the Allied victory. The true brutality of the campaign and the fallacy of the soft underbelly were exemplified by the Battle of Troina, a week-long struggle fought by the US 1st Infantry Division from July 31st to August 6th. Troina, a small hilltop town, was the linchpin of the German defense line, a natural fortress dominating the mountainous terrain. The Germans, primarily the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, fought with a desperate tenacity, using the terrain to their maximum advantage. The Americans were forced to engage in brutal close-quarters combat, clearing house by house, ridge by ridge, under constant artillery and mortar fire. The battle became a microcosm of the entire Italian campaign to come. Slow, costly, and attritional, the US forces suffered over 1,400 casualties in this single engagement, a clear and bloody indication that the soft underbelly was in fact defended by a tough, bony spine of determined German soldiers. The German forces, however, were able to use the delay bought at Troina to further consolidate their withdrawal to Messina, making their eventual escape more likely. On August 17, 1943, a reconnaissance patrol from Patton's 7th Army entered the shattered city of Messina. Just hours later, a column of British tanks arrived to find the Americans already in possession of the city. The final objective. Patton had won his race, a personal vindication, but the victory was hollowed out by the successful German escape. The 38-day campaign for Sicily was over. It was a major Allied victory that achieved its primary goals. It secured the Mediterranean sea lanes, led directly to the fall of Mussolini, and knocked Italy out of the war. But it was a victory with a bitter aftertaste. The failure to trap and destroy the German army, the fierce and public rivalry between the Allied commanders, and the tough, costly fighting against the skilled German rearguard were stark lessons. As the Allies stood looking across the narrow strait to the Italian mainland, they knew the road to Rome would be long and hard. The gamble in the sun was over, but a greater, bloodier campaign on the European continent was just beginning. The primary objective of any successful invasion is to trap and destroy the enemy force, and in this, Operation Husky had failed spectacularly. Under the brilliant and ruthless command of General der Panzertruppe Hans Valentin Huber, the Germans had executed one of the most successful strategic evacuations of the entire war. Dubbed Operation Lehrgang, the withdrawal across the Strait of Messina was a masterpiece of organization under fire. Hube created the Messina Fortress, a densely packed and ferociously effective anti-aircraft umbrella of over 500 flak guns that made it nearly impossible for Allied aircraft to interdict the evacuation. Over 6 nights and 7 days, a continuous flotilla of ferries, landing craft, and even Seabull ferries shuttled back and forth under this protective shield. By the time Patton and Montgomery reached Messina, over 40,000 German troops, 9,600 vehicles, 47 tanks, 94 guns, and 2,000 tons of ammunition and fuel had been safely transported to the Italian mainland. They had also evacuated nearly 70,000 Italian soldiers. This was not a routed mob. It was a hardened, battle-tested army that would now form the core of the German defense in Italy. The Allies would face these same divisions at Salerno, at Anzio, and in the brutal mountain battles of the Winter Line at Monte Cassino. The failure to prevent this evacuation was a significant strategic blunder, born of Allied caution, the formidable German rearguard actions, and the incredible difficulty of interdicting a narrow strait defended by such concentrated and lethal firepower. The campaign also left a legacy of deep-seated inter-Allied friction that would linger. The rivalry between Patton and Montgomery, stoked by the boundary change that marginalized the Americans, had escalated into a personal and public feud that captivated the press and worried high command. Patton, feeling his army had been sidelined and disrespected, channeled his fury into his audacious drive to Palermo and the northern coast. This race was as much about personal glory and proving American military prowess as it was about defeating the Germans. While it captured headlines and demonstrated impressive American mobility and aggression, it also drew forces away from the critical eastern flank, arguably making it easier for the Germans to consolidate their retreat towards Messina without being pressed from the north. This friction was not limited to the field commanders. At the higher levels, the fundamental disagreement over grand strategy persisted. General Marshall and the US War Department viewed the entire Italian campaign, now inevitable after Sicily, with deep suspicion. They saw it as the very suction pump they had feared, draining men, ships, and landing craft from the build-up for the cross-channel invasion, now codenamed Overlord. Every division sent to Italy was a division not training in England for the main event. The British, conversely, saw Italy as the correct and logical path, maintaining constant pressure on the enemy, engaging German divisions that might otherwise be sent to Russia or France, and threatening the soft underbelly of the Balkans. The campaign also exposed significant and dangerous weaknesses in Allied combined operations that needed urgent rectification. Air-ground coordination remained problematic throughout. The infamous friendly fire incident of July 11th, when Allied naval and anti-aircraft gunners, jumpy and poorly briefed, shot down 23 C-47 transport planes carrying the US 82nd Airborne Division during a reinforcement mission, resulted in 318 casualties, and highlighted catastrophic failures in communication and recognition. The paratroopers, many of whom had just survived the initial chaotic jump, were tragically killed by their own side, a devastating failure that led to immediate, intense review of identification procedures and protocols. Similarly, the initial dispersed landing plan, though corrected by Montgomery's intervention, revealed a staff still learning how to plan for such a colossal and complex undertaking. The lessons of Sicily, both the successes of the revised, concentrated landings and the failures in exploitation and inter-service cooperation, would be studied intensely for the invasions to come, particularly the D-Day landings in Normandy, where these hard-learned lessons would be applied to great effect. A final, controversial and shadowy element of the campaign was the alleged role of the Sicilian mafia. Decades of Mussolini's brutal suppression had driven the mafia underground, creating a network of anti-fascist contacts that the American Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, sought to exploit. While the dramatic historical narrative of the mafia opening the gates for the Allies is largely myth, there is undeniable evidence of limited collaboration. The ONI, working with imprisoned figures like Lucky Luciano from his cell, sought to secure the docks of New York from sabotage and gain intelligence on Sicilian harbors and coastal defenses. Once on the island, Allied military government, AMGOT officials, lacking local knowledge and seeking stability and order amid the chaos, often appointed known mafia figures as mayors and local administrators, inadvertently restoring the power structure that Mussolini had dismantled. This decision, born of expediency and a profound ignorance of the local political landscape, had long-lasting and tragic consequences for post-war Sicily, demonstrating the complex and often unforeseen political fallout of military intervention. On the ground, the nature of the fighting had been a brutal awakening for many Allied soldiers. While the Italian coastal divisions had largely collapsed, the German troops, from the hardened veterans of the 15th Panzergrenadier Division to the fanatical young soldiers of the Hermann Göring Division, fought with skill and tenacity. The terrain of Sicily, far from being the soft underbelly, was a defender's dream, mountainous, rocky, cut with ravines, and easily dominated by a handful of men in well-chosen positions. The political consequences of the victory were immediate and profound. On July 25, 1943, while the battle for Sicily still raged, Benito Mussolini was summoned to the royal palace by King Victor Emmanuel III, dismissed from office and arrested. The new government, led by Marshal Pietro Badoglio, immediately began secret negotiations with the Allies to surrender. This was the ultimate political prize Churchill had sought. However, the subsequent negotiations were fraught with confusion and delay, complicated by the Allied demand for unconditional surrender proclaimed at Casablanca. This delay gave the Germans crucial time to react and plan their countermove. When Italy's surrender was finally announced on September 8, 1943, the Germans were ready. They executed Operation Axi with ruthless efficiency, disarming the Italian army and seizing control of the entire country in a matter of days. The Allies, instead of landing in a friendly Italy, found themselves assaulting a hostile shore at Salerno against a fully prepared and furious German enemy. The near disaster at Salerno was a direct consequence of the strategic and diplomatic confusion following the Sicilian victory. The Allies had won the island, but lost the initiative on the mainland, setting the stage for a long and grueling campaign up the Italian peninsula. For the common soldiers, Sicily was a campaign of extremes. They experienced the initial terror of the landing in a storm, the euphoria of the easy advance against the Italians, the shock of the first fierce German counterattacks at Gela and the Simeto River, the sheer exhaustion of mountain fighting in the brutal summer heat, and the scourge of malaria and other diseases. They also witnessed the corrosive effects of combat fatigue and the dark side of liberation, as the island's complex web of mafia ties and black market operations began to intertwine with the Allied military government. The experience forged a veteran core for the battles ahead, but also exacted a heavy psychological toll. The command repercussions were swift and severe for one man. General Patton's brilliant drive and flank maneuver across Sicily was tragically overshadowed by two infamous incidents, where he slapped soldiers suffering from battle fatigue in field hospitals, calling them cowards. When the story broke in the press months later, It created a firestorm of controversy that nearly ended his career. He was forced to make a public apology and was sidelined for a crucial 11 months, a severe punishment for one of the Allies' most aggressive and successful field commanders. This personal tragedy for Patton underscored the growing, if still primitive, understanding of the psychological costs of war and the changing standards for military leadership. In the final analysis, Sicily was a decisive but deeply flawed victory, a crucial, if painful, learning experience for the Allied war machine. It provided the Allies with an invaluable, practical education in large-scale amphibious planning, inter-service cooperation, and the immense challenges of combined Allied command, lessons that were directly applied to the far more complex and successful planning for D-Day. The failures in exploitation and the inability to trap the German army taught valuable, costly lessons in the need for speed, aggression, and the primacy of destroying the enemy over the mere capture of territory. The campaign proved unequivocally that the Western Allies could fight and win a major continental campaign, but it also revealed with stark clarity that the road to Berlin would be longer, harder, and bloodier than anyone had hoped after the successes in North Africa. The gamble in the sun was over, but the cost of the education it provided would be paid in full on the bloody beaches of Normandy and in the frozen mountains of Italy. The strategic value of the Mediterranean was secured, but the price of attacking the so-called soft underbelly had been paid in full, revealing it to be a tough and resilient foe. The campaign remains a powerful and enduring case study in the complexities of coalition warfare, where competing political goals, combustible personal rivalries, and harsh military realities constantly clash, shaping the course of history in ways both triumphant and tragic.